Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How's it going, Sasha? How are you?
It's going well. It feels like we haven't been here for a while, but this is a good episode, a good one to come back to.
Yeah, it felt like coming home in a way, speaking with the parents. And, you know, this was I thought a really reflective episode, especially we've been doing this for some years now. And then speaking to, a parent who's so engaged, who has such a great organisation and who's so thoughtful and reflective. It really feels like we've come of age as a kind of an understanding of gender dysphoria and how it impacts parents. So I thought it was a very kind of mature conversation that was really, really, really brought a lot of insight.
Yeah, so we talked to Lydia, who runs the website ROGDboys.org, and she tells us about the kinds of parents in her group. And remarkably, her son's experience with gender dysphoria started with a quiz. He took a quiz online based on your personality traits and preferences that told him he was 80% girl. And soon thereafter came to mom and dad with a request. I need hormones. I'd like to make my body 80% girl. And I think even in that story, which of course is just the beginning of a kind of unfolding drama in their family, tells you something about the types of boys that fall into this, which is like, they really like rules. They really like to follow systems. They are checklist kind of kids, very, very intelligent, but have some black and white thinking. And as you'll hear from Lydia, this becomes a very common profile that they see over and over and over again with parents that join their group.
And there's something so kind of dissonant that, like, you've got a very intelligent person who comes out with this idea that they can be 80% a girl with certain hormonal kind of injections. It's so off the wall, if you follow me, as a kind of a formula. But that's one of the reasons why lots of parents underestimate it, because they think, well, this is crazy talk. And he's an intelligent boy, so I'll just kind of put that aside, and he'll come to his senses. He's obviously having just a teenage kind of attack there, and they don't. They get in deep. There's something about the literal way a lot of young people are understanding. I think it definitely seems to be to do with a certain mind meets the computer, and they go deeper into a black and white thinking, a kind of a formulaic way of saying. I remember you called it was like Mr. Potato Head, that they can kind of put in different kind of elements into their body, and that will make them the person that they want to be, with no understanding of the complexity of being human and an absolute scientific kind of mathematical, crazy understanding of what it is to be human.
Yeah. And I mean, I even remember when Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous astrophysicist, said something about this online, kind of propping up gender ideology. And it was just so unbelievable. But to be fair, I mean, if there are adults kind of sharing these weird ideas, you know, what chance does a 14-year-old stand against it? So I really empathize with them. Another interesting thing you'll hear in Lydia's story is that she grew up in a high control religious upbringing, and she actually lost her family when she decided to leave this group. So she said that having that background helped her recognize some of those kind of control tactics and mechanisms that she saw happening with her son as he got further and further into a belief system around gender. And, you know, we touch on a theme which has come up many times on our show, which is that I think a lot of these boys questioning their gender crave an intimacy that they want to have with girls, which is actually quite a normal thing for straight boys to want.
Totally.
And they may be that kind of awkward, shy kid who doesn't really know how to start up a conversation with a girl he likes. And then all of a sudden he announces trans and he finds himself the center of attention, getting invited to girls' sleepovers, and they're brushing his hair and they're like being so sweet and gentle with him. And that is such a tempting experience for a boy who's just kind of coming into his own.
And, a lot of boys, they're kind of shocked at how kind of tough they're meant to be. And so this tenderness and gentleness, it really sings to them, especially a certain type of boy. There's a certain type of boy who does not want that kind of rough and ready life. They're a gentler soul. And when the girls kind of are primping and preening them, it's just genuinely good for them. They feel the better for it. This kind of like loving touch that is
Yeah.
so kind of sweetly kind of bestowed. I do think it's very important, to recognize that, like we talk about ROGD all the time, the ratio is considered around about consistently 70-30. So
Yeah.
for every 70 girls, there's about 30 boys. So ROGD boys, and the website rogdboys.org, it's such an important website. And it's so important that they have their voice, because they've been written out. They were written out quite cruelly for quite some time. So I'm so glad that they've kind of organized themselves so that they have their specific points, because these are a very specific type of boy that's getting caught up in this.
Yeah, and just a quick note about the parents. You'll hear Lydia kind of describe this in greater detail, but there seems to be this idea that, like, if your kid is struggling with gender dysphoria, it's because you're parenting in this way or that way, as though there's some sort of formula. But she says, we've had every kind of family constellation and type of family from different backgrounds that you can imagine in our group, and there is no pattern. So I think that's just important to keep in mind, because lots of people are hypothesizing about what's going on here, but actually there's like every kind of family you can imagine may find their child getting caught up with gender identity beliefs. There is no pattern.
Yeah. They've been treated so cruelly and so badly. I really think that we should have a lot of time and sympathy and, care for the parents wrapped up in this.
Yeah. So I'll just tell you a little bit more. She's an advocate and representative of, again, a coalition comprised of parents, health experts, professional educators, and concerned citizens who are focused on the medicalization of young men and boys grappling with gender identity confusion. She has a PhD in biochemistry with over 20 years of experience in both K through 12 and higher education. And Lydia brings a unique perspective to this critical issue. She's married to another PhD scientist, so like two scientist parents, and she's the mother of several children, as you'll hear, one of whom began to identify as gender fluid at 14 during the pandemic. And of course, we'll also include the link to the ROGD Boys website, which we really encourage you to check out. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Hi, Stella, and welcome to the show, Lydia.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I think it's so important that we lift this issue. I just did a conference, or not a conference, a survey on ROGD kids, and 70% are girls and 30% are boys. And that seems to be the very strong, steady number at this stage. So these ROGD boys need to have a way more attention than, and I think you're the woman to do it.
Well, thank you. I totally agree. I've been involved with this group of parents now for about 5 years, and every year it's about 30% boys. All the data we've collected, it's about 30% boys. And I understand why the attention's on girls, because when we first started seeing this phenomena, it was little boys and old men. And then all of a sudden, this tsunami of young women started to identify as these alternate genders. And so, yeah, there's this huge flip. But what I think a lot of people don't know is that the increase also was seen with the boys. So we went from a handful of young boys and a handful of older men to also seeing a huge surge. I think the last time the numbers we have, it looks like about a 1900% increase, 2000% increase in the number of boys, adolescent boys who are identifying as alternate genders. And this is not a population that was seen in the original cohort that had been studied.
And you have a personal story to share. Maybe we can start there, and then we'll talk a little bit more about your group and the amazing website, which is honestly chock full of so much helpful information. But tell us, how did this kind of impact you and your family?
So, like a lot of people in my group, this started during the pandemic. We were shut down where I lived very severely. We were not allowed to go to the grocery store. We were not allowed to go to the park. You weren't supposed to talk to your neighbors. It was a very hard shutdown. And at that time, my son was 14 years old and in a really critical stage of adolescent development where you're supposed to start figuring out who you are and individuating from your parents. And instead of having healthy outlets for doing that, he was online for 14 to 16 hours a day between school, between getting together with friends. We were very strict parents about internet usage up until the pandemic. And then we needed to encourage him to maintain connection to his friends and peers. Stuck in a house with all of the rest of his siblings and his parents is not a healthy place for a 14-year-old. And so we encouraged it. We encouraged him to play games online with his friends. We encouraged him to have video chats with his friends. We encouraged him to do all of these things online. We thought a pretty good relationship with him where we were pretty open about appropriate internet use and sites he should and shouldn't go on. But it fell apart so rapidly. So about 6 months into the pandemic, he was 15 years old. He came to us and announced that he was gender fluid. He had taken a survey with his friends, and his survey indicated that he was 80% female. So he's a very gifted black and white thinker. He's not on the autism spectrum. That's a question I get a lot. He's just profoundly gifted. This kid was reading at 2 years old. He was doing algebra when he was in the first grade. We're talking an extremely gifted kid. So, but very rigid thinker, extremely rigid thinker. So when he took a quiz and it said he was supposed to be 80% girl, he decided that he needed to microdose estrogen to make his body 80% female. Otherwise, he would commit suicide, which is what he had been told by the internet, by his friends at school. And
what age was he at this point?
he had just turned 15. So this started when he was 14, and he came to us for medical treatment when he was 15. We didn't know it at the time, but he had given us a 24-hour deadline to get him medical treatment or get him started on medical treatment. Otherwise, it would prove we were transphobic and abusive, and all bets were off. And from there, our family life absolutely fell apart. Just completely fell apart. We were the enemy. We were stopping him from receiving his necessary medical care, and we hated him and we wanted him to die. And I know these things because we later on had a suicide self-harm attempt, and we had to go through all of his communications with his friends, and we saw the texts that had been exchanged, and it was like the most bizarre thing I had ever seen. When he first came to us, both my husband and I were very loving. I had been aware of this contagion for a while because I am in education. So I am a PhD chemist, and I have taught for 20 years at every level of education, middle school, high school, college, all of it. I've seen the contagion. I was aware of it. I thought it was girls, which is another reason why I got involved with the website, which we'll talk about, because I didn't know it could happen to boys. So I knew what it was. So I did all the things you're supposed to do, right? I gave him a hug. I told him that he was a good person, that we loved him no matter what, that I didn't think it was healthy to put labels on him at this age, that we would figure this out together. And then I said, would you like to talk to a therapist about it? But see, that's the part I didn't know. I didn't know how captured everything was at that point. And it fell apart from there. Our household turned into absolute turmoil. He got angrier and angrier and more depressed as he kept going further down. This is my new name. You have to call me with these pronouns. Any sign of hesitancy on our part was a mark against us. And he got angrier and angrier. He got abusive physically towards his younger siblings, verbally and emotionally to the rest of us. And we were completely lost. We saw numerous therapists that we vetted first. It's the same story that all of us have heard 1,000 times at this point. So, I mean, I don't have a lot new there. It's everyone can fill in the gaps. Now, I'll tell you the one big difference. Well, there's two, I suppose. One, he has two very educated parents. Yeah.
I think, that might be very well known among the parents. It's not quite as well known among everybody else. I'm always continuously surprised about how little people actually know about the parents.
Well, I'm willing to talk about it.
Just a little bit, Just give a little. Yeah. You said you cycled through a few therapists. So were they all affirmative?
Yeah. So the first therapist we found was through our church. We went to a liberal Christian church. I'm not particularly religious. In my biography that I have sent to different people, I think including you guys, I talk about how I was raised in a very fundamentalist, high intensity religion. It was extremely gender rigid. It was, a lot of people view it as a cult. The religion that I was raised in, a lot of people view as a cult. So we went to a liberal church just so that our kids would have kind of a community, because I really felt that was important. But so the first therapist we found was through our church, and she was okay, but she didn't understand what it was. She had a friend who had transitioned later in life, and he was so much happier, and he's a good guy, and these things happen. And she could not understand why our child was so maladaptive and angry. She believed that we must be abusing him because he was acting like an abused child.
Yeah.
But this was all the online fearfulness.
But the therapists, that had been... I hate to say this, but so many of the therapists are kind of framing this triangulation, framing the parents as the persecutors while the therapist is the savior. This triangulation of the child as the victim, it's brain damaging and very destructive to families.
Yeah, and I also want to say, this came up for me this week in a conversation. Sometimes therapists, almost like all they have are these textbook explanations of things. And so when you see erratic behavior, you may not understand that that's part of the kind of thought control mechanisms of the online world. You also may not understand that somebody who has rigid thinking and is gifted is going to get latched onto ideas. So like I've met lots of families who tell me about the therapist that their kid was seeing, and I'm like, oh, what you're describing is your child's OCD. But the therapist said, oh, this is the worst gender dysphoria I've ever seen.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's like a misattribution of the behaviors and the way that the kid is showing up in therapy. So I think you're pointing out something a lot of parents listening to this will be like, oh yeah, I recognize that misunderstanding. So keep going. So that's the first therapist.
So that was the first therapist. And because she would not immediately, she wanted to talk about family structure. She wanted to have family therapy, which is why we had hired her. I had done a lot of research by this point. I'm a researcher. So what's the first thing I did? I read the entire internet. I stayed up for 3 days. I read the whole internet.
And I believe you.
Yeah. So I knew what to do. I had read all of the stuff you guys had put out at that point, which was not as much as now because it was still new. I had read everything that I could find. So I knew the questions to ask. So I had vetted her, and she said, yeah, we'll do family therapy. And I was like, great. He would not do family therapy. He absolutely refused to do family therapy. And he wanted her to write him a letter to get hormones. And when she said, we really need to get everyone on board with this before we do this, I don't know if it's the right choice for you yet. He just would sit there and he refused to communicate, and she fired him. So that was the first therapist. She couldn't work with him anymore. She said she was still willing to work with us as parents, but she couldn't work with him because he was absolutely refusing to communicate. And to be fair to her, part of the problem was we were still in the pandemic, and so it was all virtual. So it's a lot harder to get a resistant person to communicate with you over the internet if they don't want to.
Oh yeah, in fairness, she never actually met him in person.
No.
Yeah.
So that was the first therapist. So then he and his friends came up with a plan to get medicalized. And the plan was he was going to convince the authorities that we were abusing him, but he didn't think that anyone would believe him, because the way we were supposedly abusing him was by not going along with this. So he had to come up with something better. And he decided the way it would be is he would accuse us of abusing his younger siblings, who were much younger than him. I mean, these are 3 and 5-year-old kids. They're much younger. So we had a second wave of children, which was great, but they're quite a bit younger. So he and his friends started, he would provoke the younger kids and then try to record them so that he could catch their screams on video and catch them out of control. And then he was going to use that to prove that we were abusing the children. And but in order to get that to work, he had to get it to an authority figure. So he faked, this sounds so terrible, but this is what happened. He faked a suicide attempt and put it online where his friends could see it. And then the police showed up to our house in the middle of the night and took him away to a psychiatric facility, is what happened. At that psychiatric facility, he then accused us of abusing our other children. And that's why, and that was going to prove that we were also abusing him.
Oh.
The first child therapist who saw him did not buy it because he's a brilliant, gifted child and he's dumb as a sack of bricks when it comes to this his story was full of holes. It didn't make any sense at all. It made no sense. So when she started questioning him, he shut down again. So they brought in a gender expert because he had told everyone he was trans. The gender expert turned out to be someone who, because I had read the whole internet, I knew exactly who this person was. It was a trans-identified female therapist who was a male, had transitioned to say she was male. I'm not going to say the name. She's well known within the community. And of course, she immediately affirmed him. They switched him over to the female ward in the children's psychiatric facility. And that started our fight to get him out of the psychiatric facility because they were going to trans him. Now, this goes into what I was going to say a moment ago about the difference with our families. He has a physical disability, which is, I believe personally, besides his giftedness, is the root of his dysphoria. And his physical disability means that there are a lot of medications that he cannot take. We have an app, actually, full of all the medications that he cannot take, or it will cause him to have a severe complication. I'm being kind of cagey about this because it's very identifiable. So he sees a specialist every year. He's on daily medication, and it's very serious. And one of the confounding drugs that he cannot take is testosterone suppressors and estrogen. Those are on the forbidden list.
And just in case anybody's worried, it's not an intersex condition. It's not a DST.
It is not an intersex condition. It is not. It is a purely biochemical condition, not a sex condition. And I know that too, because ironically, in order to diagnose him with the condition, he did have to have his genome sequenced. So I know what his genome is actually, because that's how he was diagnosed with this condition, is we had to sequence his genome when he was about 2 years old. So he's not intersex. He's completely male. And when they were pushing us to start him on medication, I said, well, what about this condition? And they said, I've never heard of that before. I said, here's all the papers. Here's the app. Here are the medications. Are you willing to be liable if he dies from this? And suddenly it was, well, I'm not really comfortable. I'm not his primary care doctor. We're going to need to get him in to see the specialist. Oh, yeah. Once they realized that this one was going to be a cause and effect potential death, suddenly they weren't so keen on forcing the medicalization against our will. And in the state where we were, he was allowed to start receiving these treatments at 14. if we didn't have a good reason not to. Like, we still had a say, we still could say no, but if we said no and they didn't think our reason was good enough, then it was kind of one of these gray areas of like, well, it's abusive. And because that was his whole plan. He was going to get put into the foster care system. And then they would medicalize him in it was a stupid plan. It was a ridiculous plan, but that was his plan. Yeah. So I then had to just get him out of my husband and I worked really hard to get him out of the psychiatric facility. And then they sent us to a gender specialist, which we did not go to. I found a DBT, dialectic behavior therapy, which I knew to be one of the best types of therapy for personality disordered people, and teens that had issues with self-harm and eating disorders. And so we went there, but they were completely affirming. And I had a whole conversation with the director of that facility with all my knowledge about this, but she had been trained by the gender clinic at the university. So I was just another problem. So there was that one. So he got fired from DBT therapy. We did that one for about 2.5 to 3 months. He got fired there, even though they were completely affirming. My husband and I completed the parenting class that they offered there, even though we couldn't do the family therapy component because he refused to participate. And so that was the there was a third therapist he'd seen, and then we tried to get him to see a fourth, and we contacted through GenSpect to try to find a fourth, and he refused at that point. And I just thought, you know what, this isn't helping. We need to do something else.
I want to go back to your experience when you were younger in this kind of high control religion. And this is going to tie in with the question that I have right now. So what I'm noticing about this story is that your son became incredibly distant and hostile as soon as he got his mind latched on this idea that I need to be medicalized, and willing to do things at any cost, willing to throw his own parents under the bus, lie about things. I mean, was that out of character for him? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, do you see this as a function of these kind of thought manipulation mechanisms? Or was this like, he's really smart and he's rigid thinking, so maybe his attachment's not always the same as his siblings, for example? Like, is this out of character for your son to be emotionally shut down from you?
This was so completely out of character. It was like I had a stranger living in my house. There was so much about this that was traumatizing. Living with a stranger who really wanted to harm the rest of us, I think sums up where a lot of the difficulty came from, because he was loving and sweet. He was very tactile in the sense that he loved to touch everybody. He wanted hugs. He wanted touch. He wanted cuddles. It was very much loving. He's very, very sensitive to other people's feelings, didn't want to hurt people, very much into things being fair and just. So this behavior was completely out of character. And yes, that is why I have brought up, and so I've written something for Pitt about my experiences growing up in that religion and how it relates to this, because it looked like the same thing to me. It looked like indoctrination. It's part of the reason why I knew not to push back on the gender thing, because I had seen so many people in my own family. I was estranged from my own family for many years when I left that organization. Because you can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason into, I think is the phrase that gets used a lot. And it's so true. I saw it over and over again when I was raised in that group and when I left the group, and I thought, I can't reason him out of this. He didn't reason himself into this. I can't touch this. This is radioactive. I need to do other things to get him out. So for the first year, the only thing I did, I made sure that I was home every single day when he came home from school so that I could say hi to him. I would watch for him out the window and make sure that I was physically in between him and his bedroom so that he had to see me and greet me before he went into his room after the pandemic lifted and he came home. that every day during the pandemic, I would make sure I would go into his room and say something nice to him every single day, because I knew that I was fighting indoctrination. I was not fighting gender dysphoria. For me, the gender dysphoria was a red herring from the very first day. For me, this was a cult. It had all of the markings of exactly what I was used to growing up. The fear, the persecution complex. And we had a phrase when I grew up that persecution is how you know you're right. So
Jeez.
Wow.
so anytime someone would push back, you're like, that's the devil trying to get me. That's the devil trying to get me. So I need to double down. I need to say my prayers. I need to recite my verses. I need to do my little mantras. And it's the same thing there, right? You push back and they have things that they say. They have ways that they cope and they go back into it so that they're not uncomfortable with anything you say. So it pushes you in further. So I knew that. I knew. But so I just tried to be that person who was like reminding him, no, your family loves you. Your family cares about you. We're not ogres. But I mean, it's been 5 years. He's not medicalized. So I view that as a win. He's over 18 now. He's not medicalized. But yeah, to go back to your question, this was completely out of character. It was like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. A completely different person lived there.
How soon did he change? Do you remember that dramatic, like he said, I need you to medicalize, and you said he'd given you 24 hours, and something that you must have answered that you passed the 24-hour test, you didn't finish that.
Yeah.
But how quickly did he change that you were the enemy?
So I had noticed something weird for about 6 months before then. Something weird. I didn't know what it was. Again, this is why I think it's so important for parents to be aware that boys can get sucked into this, because I didn't know what it was. So I kept trying to figure it out. I would ask him questions. He's getting more and more secretive. Me being me, I've been working with teenagers for 20 years. I thought, well, he's hitting puberty. He's being secretive. The testosterone's taking over. He doesn't want me to know what he's looking at. I'm just going to try to still be there for him. And his dad was always really involved. I hear a lot of stuff about, well, the dads are absent. No, my husband's been extremely involved with everything with our kids for the second they were born. He wanted nothing more than to be a daddy, so it wasn't that. It was weird. And I just kept thinking, okay, what's going on? I know there's an adjustment going on because puberty, middle school, things are hard. And then the pandemic hit. Well, of course he's weird then. Everybody's weird. I was weird. The whole world was weird. So that wasn't surprising. So I'd noticed it for a while. And then when he announced, I said, is this why you've been acting so different? Is this what you've been struggling with? And he said, yes. I said, okay, we're going to figure this out together. We're going to figure this out. We still love you. Everything's going to be okay. And then the 24 hours passed, and it was a hurricane. Like, it was the fury. The other thing that happened is he started adopting autistic traits.
Oh yeah.
They were fake. He started hand flapping. He'd never hand flapped before. Yeah. He started to hand flap. He started to do little Tourette's things, which after I read the whole internet, I knew that this was part of the whole social contagion. So I was like watching these things. He was starting just really mean and sneaky to the siblings is the big thing, because he was trying to provoke something. So it got worse. But the change that I'd seen for about 6 months before that.
It's really a devastating story. And I have to say, sadly, I've heard this story so many times. And I always ask that question, like, was this out of character? Because, I can imagine listeners who haven't sat through thousands of hours of consults or whatever, like being like, well, some kids are just really, they never bonded with their parents or whatever. And I'm like, no, there's usually a 180 that has happened over the course, in your case, of about 6 months. But I always like to ask about that because I think it's important. You said it's been 5 years now and he hasn't medicalized. Are you in contact at all?
Yes. He is in college now. He seems to be doing well. Contact is pretty regular. He's living in the female dorms. He's using his fake name, and he goes by female pronouns. He does have the tendency, and again, this is very common with the boys, he doesn't dress like a girl.
Yeah.
He has long hair. He does not wear makeup. He doesn't paint his nails. There's nothing feminine about him. He buys female sweatpants. He buys female t-shirts. But he wears.
Could I come in on that? Because I'd love to hear
Yeah.
your thoughts on this, because it looks to me like there's very much a female gender dysphoria, which uses all the accoutrements as if it's jewellery, whether it's the clothes
Yes,
and the
makeup and jewelry.
deodorant. Yeah, they have the equivalent of makeup and jewellery, but it's, male deodorant or whatever the hell they're using.
Right.
And then there's male gender dysphoria, where they're like, no messing around with the fripperies, give me the drugs.
No.
And
That's right.
I'm going to take the drugs and I'm going to come out like Cinderella. And I'm living in a parallel universe where my height and my broadness and all of that is going to, they're not
irrelevant.
they're not even hearing it. They're not even seeing the fact that it's
Yeah.
difficult. You're 6'4" and you're broad. I'm not saying you're a child, but you know what I mean? They can't
I
even
know.
see it because they think, I'm going to be a beautiful woman. There's an extraordinary level of unreality that they have attached to these drugs. But anyway, that's my own kind of very
That
quick.
is
I'd like to hear your version of.
Our group has hundreds of parents of trans-identified boys and young men in it. This is the way that it goes. They think the drugs will turn them into a girl. So most of them do not play around with trying to pretend to be a girl until they're actually turned into a girl, which obviously they can't be actually turned into a girl, but they believe that the drugs are magic, which is another reason I relate this to religion.
They have a testosterone-like certainty and directness that it's so male. Their way
it's linear.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely the truth. So most of the boys that we've seen do not start presenting as female until after they've started medicalizing. And that's very different than the girls. So I've had experiences with a lot of young people that are identifying as alternate genders as a teacher. And it's that every time. The girls will come in and they have this persona that they have on. They cut their hair. And they wear the clothes, and they all have a different look. Yep, and the mannerisms, and they'll have like little badges all over with their pronouns and like little, trans kids matter and like all the little stuff all over. The boys don't do that.
Play that game.
No. Even the ones who are medicalized, they still don't do that. They'll dress female. I hate to use words like this because despite my appearance today, I'm a pretty hardcore scientist. I'm not particularly gender conforming.
So are you wearing a costume, so to speak?
I am. I'm wearing a costume
this is a disguise.
Today.
Okay.
Yeah, a bit of one.
I was wondering that.
Yep, it is. I'm very well known in my field. So if someone wants to find me and they look at this, but if it's in passing, they'll probably be like, oh, that's not her. So we'll see if it works.
So you're saying this is common about the boys. Keep going. Yeah,
it's common. I've had boys in my courses, in my classes who've been fully medicalized. They'll wear a little makeup, they'll dress, but some of the stuff you see online with these over the top stuff, I haven't had so much of that, but they don't tend to, I don't know. I feel like it's a lot more performative with the girls that I've interacted with than the boys. The boys think once they take the medicine, then they're just turned into the girl. And they don't
sort of like Cinderella.
Like Cinderella.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've noticed with our boys is that they have a very rich fantasy life. They seem to have a difficult time in the real world. It's not fair. It's not predictable. The rules don't make sense. There's supposed to be rules, right? If you follow the rules, you're supposed to be okay. And in the real world, the rules don't work anymore. They don't work.
that seems to be a key thing about reaching these boys, that if they're online in their room, they're creating a fantasy world, which is why they don't want to be interrupted, because you're actually dragging them
Yeah.
out of a gorgeous fantasy. That's why it's so difficult on the parents who do knock on the door and say, come on in or come
Yeah.
on out or whatever, because they're like, I'm
There's
in
a,
my fantasy, get out of there. They don't
yeah.
want
Well,
reality.
there's a terrible story that was just out in the last couple of days about a young man who terminated himself from one of these AI chatbots because he had fallen in love with it. His 14 or 15-year-old
Saw
kid. It was
that,
just out
yeah.
yesterday or today. And it was the same thing. He was self-aware. He said, I like the fantasy world more than I
Yeah.
like the real one. He
I've
knew it was a
worked with boys
fantasy.
like that, and they've argued very strongly. I prefer
Hmm.
life online. I prefer my virtual life.
Yes.
I prefer my friends virtually. I prefer it all on.
Yeah.
And up until
That's
COVID,
my son.
I used to half buy it. And then when COVID happened and I had to live online, I realized, no, this is a half life. They
It
kept on
is.
arguing with me that they were the digital generation, that there was this whole digital world that I didn't understand. It's
Hmm.
a half life. It's
It's a
not a real
half-life.
life. Yeah.
And critically, it's a half-life during the time that you're supposed to be figuring out some of the fundamental things about your real life. One of the things about the boys is the sexuality aspect, right? It's like a freight train hit them.
Yeah.
And what we've noticed is with our boys who are uncomfortable with reality, having that very uncontrolled reminder that you are an animal, a mammal who has the need to
It
have
frightens them.
physical, yeah, it's terrifying to them. And that's another thing that we've noticed with our boys. A lot of ink is spilled around the boys being sexually deviant pervert boys. Okay, well, I'm not going to argue that they're teenage boys. Yes, yes, but I should say and our boys tend to be terrified of it. The boys that we
Yeah.
have in our groups are terrified of being that. They don't want to be out of control. They don't want to be a predator. They don't want to be the persecutor. They don't want to be this toxic male. And some of them don't think that they think they're supposed to be, and they can't. So with my son, for example, I don't think he felt capable of being this alpha male guy because of this physical disability he had. I've talked to my brothers about this because one of them has the same problem, and he went through a horrible bout of gender dysphoria when he was a teenager. Horrible gender dysphoria. He didn't feel like he could make it as a man because he was precluded from doing certain physical activities due to this disability. So he went definitely through huge gender dysphoria, but it was the 90s. It was the early 90s. And what happened in the 90s? You dressed up like Boy George, you put on some eyeliner, you went
Yeah.
out into the streets and had a good time, and then you came home and you grew up and you're fine.
Yeah.
But now he tells me he would have for sure been fully on board with this because he had
Fascinating.
crippling gender dysphoria due to this physical disability. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's such a polarization in the types of role models available right now to young men.
Yeah.
And
God,
something I
yeah.
love about your website is that there's a section called Fleeing Masculinity, where you have
Yes.
a variety of interesting articles, videos by commenters from like all over the spectrum that aren't necessarily about gender dysphoria per se, but just like the difficulties that young men are having right now in our society, in our culture, in these online spaces. And I also think, many of these young men, perhaps like as you're describing here, Lydia, your son felt like because of his physical disability, he couldn't really embody that alpha male role. And I presume
Yeah.
that on top of that, there's the kind of Me Too movement and like all of their female friends talking about feeling intimidated or kind of objectified by males. And a lot of these
Yep.
boys are like, well, I don't want to be that. Like, even if I
That's
could
right.
be, I don't think I'd want to be like that. And
Yep.
so they're either like pendulum swinging between like an Andrew Tate kind of version of a guy or like a Sam Smith, a non-binary kind of like
Yeah.
trans. So it's
Right.
so interesting. There's like not a lot of healthy landing places where guys can explore their more sensitive side or have a different way of interacting with women. It's like these very polarized categories.
That's
And
right.
this is a big piece of it here. Like, in addition to the giftedness and maybe some of the autism traits and the black and white thinking, there's a real desire to be like a collaborator and ally to women. And there's like they don't know how else to do that other than through like a social justice lens.
That's what we're seeing as well. So we've had several different surveys and polls, both formal and informal, in our group. And we put the results kind of in the website, not all of them, but the ones that we felt really comfortable saying, yeah, this is a thing. So the group of boys that we're specifically talking about, they are usually very gifted. They have autism-like traits, although right now we're exploring the idea of this, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Extra sensitive, super sensitive people. So there was a hypersensitive, but it's like a Venn diagram where you have you have autism, you have highly sensitive, and then there's another one. And we have a lot of highly sensitive boys. They're not necessarily on the autism spectrum, but there's overlap with the autism traits. So and gifted, that's right. It was autistic, highly sensitive, and then gifted. And then, so we have boys that are in between those bits. Those are these boys. So it's boys who are autistic and highly sensitive, or it's boys who are highly sensitive and gifted. It's these overlapping traits that make them uncomfortable in normal society, is what it is. And so they don't know how to relate to normal society. So we're seeing that. They are typically have some sort of traumatic event, or like breakup of a friend group, or COVID. Very similar to the girls. I mean, a lot of this is very similar to the girls. We also see that they are very, very afraid or reticent around sexuality, and they don't understand how to have healthy masculinity is the other one. So that is why on our website, we really tried hard not to get too much in the weeds of why are they doing this? It's like they're doing this because they're unhappy. They're doing this because they don't like themselves. They're doing this because they're trying to figure out their place in the world. For me, that's where it kind of overlaps again with my religious upbringing. Highly rigid religions that recruit target a certain type of a person. They target seekers who are unhappy. So if you're somebody who has like a lot of big feelings that other people don't relate to, and you get really excited about stuff that nobody cares about, or you feel things really deeply, and other people are like, why do you care about that? I saw that didn't bother me. I relate to that. I'm that kind of a person. I'm a highly gifted, super sensitive person. There are movies I can't watch. I'm a vivid dreamer, so I have dreams that I feel, I taste, I smell, like they feel real to me. I get it. So when you have that kind of personality, and then you're so depressed, especially when you're 15, 16 years old, and you're looking around going, this is it? This is it? What am I supposed to do with this? I don't understand how this works. Nobody is like me. I'm so alone. I'm so sad. And then somebody comes in, whether it's a religion, whether it's a cult, whether it's this, they come in and say, do you know what? I have the solution. Here's a list of things that you need to do. And if you go down this list, which also is very appealing to this kind of person, you go down this list, and when you get to the end of it, you'll be beautiful, you'll be happy, you'll understand how the world works, you're going to have a community around you who's just like you. My goodness, who could turn that down? Nobody can turn that down.
Yeah, and particularly like one of the things that I think about a lot with the boys is that because of these overwhelming, powerful sexual drives and just the way boys and girls interact, a lot of these boys are really sensitive to being called creepy or gross or whatever. And there are cases I've heard of where maybe a boy makes a gross comment or something and is ostracized from his friend group. And so the idea of becoming beautiful and appealing and non-threatening. Like that is amazing too, because male insecurity can go lots of different ways. There's the guys that are like, well, I want to become this big buff bodybuilder. I want to get like jacked, strong.
Yeah.
But there's also a version of like, I don't want to be a creepy guy ever. So I'd like to
Yes.
become a pretty, lovely, non-threatening girl.
And then there's this other part of it too, which is, I think, more unique to the boys, which is if they're straight, especially, but I think gay boys, the same thing. They crave touch. These boys crave touch. They're not allowed to be touched at this age. Like you don't get hugs from your bros. Like that's weird, man. That, no homo. Like that's the thing that they'll say. But they don't touch very much, and you can't get snuggles from your mom anymore. That's weird, right? So what happens, and we've seen this over and over again in our group, is that the boys, once they identify as an alternate gender, the girls are no longer off limits to them. The girls will flock to them because now they're safe. So the boys are getting touched. They're getting hugs, but they're also getting their makeup done. The girls are putting lotion on their faces and giving them facials. They're stroking their hair. They're braiding it. They're giving them cute hairdos. They're telling them how beautiful they are. And they're just showering with attention. We call these girls the cheerleaders in our group, not to denigrate like the pom-pom girls, but because these girls are so influential on these boys. A lot of our boys, their first sexual experiences have been with one of these girls who is telling them that they are a beautiful girl, and they're giving them clothes and doing their hair and touching them, and they're lesbians together. And that the male sexuality is a very strong force. And if this is the way that they're getting physical female attention, and they don't feel capable of getting it in boy mode, that's going to be a very, very difficult thing for them to turn away from. Very difficult.
That female cheerleader has been, in the parents I've worked with, she's been such a destructive force.
Yes.
It couldn't be underestimated, the impact of the female cheerleader. I wonder, how many of your boys that you've kind of noticed are gay? Like how many of the ROGD boys are gay ROGD boys, or are you counting that?
We count them. We definitely see some of it. It's hard to know. Honestly, their sexuality gets so messed up from this. I don't think if they know if they're gay or straight anymore. My son, for example, he first said he was bisexual, but that, of course, is not good. And so now he's pan. He's never, ever, as far as we know, had a relationship with another male. It's only been females, but they all identify as other things. So he would tell you that he is bi, but he's never had any relationship with anyone other than a female person. So it gets a little confusing, honestly. But there is definitely a contingent. I can think of 5 or 6 right off the top of my head who are clearly gay, who don't want to be gay. We have a lot of boys that their parents later discovered that they had been sexually abused right at the beginning or right before puberty hit. So that they were groomed either online or in person and
That's
sexually
what I was going
abused.
to say. The groomed online ROGD kid is a thing, especially among the boys. It's very easy to groom a boy where testosterone has just arrived. And it seems to me that there's predatory men online playing games specifically looking for those boys and getting them. And they're a whole thing, and it feels like it hasn't really been there hasn't been a spotlight on that. For me, I don't think half enough. And I think each parents I've worked with, when they realize this is grooming, this is a result of grooming, the parents are devastated. And I'm like, it's a thing. It's a thing. These boys are particularly vulnerable to it.
They are. And I think another thing to mention is it's the miasma of it as well, because if you have, at my child's school, he went to a small high school. It was about 150 kids in his graduating class. 37 of them were trans.
Wow.
A third. Well,
yeah. And that's been pretty consistent at this particular school. And it's about 30% of them are boys. And so I hear a lot of, well, why didn't you get him off the internet? You should have been a better parent. You should have watched him. The problem you have is, even if you're strict, if you're not around everyone else who's strict, you can't stop your kid from talking to other kids. That's not health. I can't keep him in a bottle in my garage, right?
Yeah,
He has to be
totally.
out in the world. So he might have come from strict parents, but all of these other kids, you get one of them that's groomed, and it goes further. And that's another thing with the cheerleader is, no, I'm not blaming the girl. I've heard a lot of that. You're blaming the girls. It's not the girl's fault. I'm not saying it's their fault. They're children. Of course it's not their fault. They're also in this.
Yeah.
But if you have the contagion enter this group of teens, it's going to get passed around everybody because they're all in the group together. So if they're online in these spaces or not, they're still going to get the blowback. So you get one boy who's been groomed online by a predator. That is going to infiltrate and affect the other kids. Absolutely. Of course it is. They're all friends. These friend groups become very important at this age. So
Yeah, and with this addition of the very black and white rigid thinking that we see so often, it makes it even more complex because that one behavior in the one kid can kind of set off a precedent for how do we make sense of these things? How do we manage them? What's the right and wrong response? And even I think about the female cheerleader, which is something we talked about early on in one of our first episodes about ROGD boys. It's like, on one hand, I also think having an experience of tenderness and care from the girl is still, it still has value in and of itself,
It
right?
does.
Like, especially if you're one of these awkward guys who has never really felt embraced or cared for, and someone comes along and is willing to be so tender and gentle with you, like that's a
Yes.
beautiful experience. But because of this black and white thinking, it kind of gets inextricably locked in with the female identity that I've adopted now. So it's the female identity that has gotten me this warmth
That's
and
right.
loving relationship, which in a way it's true, but in a way it's not. So it's very hard for them to understand the nuance and split apart these different elements of their experience because of this kind of thinking pattern that they tend to have.
And I think on top of that, when you have all of the adults in their life, with the exception of their parents, then reaffirming that that is correct. You go to school and you're said, yes, you'll never make it as a boy, but as a girl, you're fantastic. That's the message that they're hearing, because maybe they weren't treated so well when they were a nerdy boy who didn't understand social cues and kept correcting the teacher, and maybe didn't have the best hygiene because they didn't think that it mattered. And suddenly they're exactly the same on the outside, but now they're declared this identity, and the teachers are falling over to be kind to them to make sure that they're comfortable. Another thing that the cheerleaders will do is they'll fight for the boys.
Yes.
So if the boy is not comfortable, and the girls all around who are sensitive to that because they're girls, they'll see he's uncomfortable. They will turn like rabid dogs on the adults in the room. How dare you? She's this, My son never expressed any desire to use opposite sex bathrooms until the cheerleaders all went to the school and told them that they had to let him.
Yeah, petitioned for him.
They petitioned, and they petitioned to let him use the female changing rooms, and they petitioned. And every time the school would call us, we would say, absolutely not. That's completely inappropriate to have a 14, 15, 16, whatever, 17, 18. Well, I guess in 18, they didn't ask us anymore, but that's inappropriate. We are not okay with that. And they would say, okay. And then they would do it anyway. And the school would just do it anyway, and we would say, no, we're not okay. But the girls would go to the school and throw a fit, and the adults are so terrified of these kids.
Yeah,
They're
and
just
it's not just the girls on that are cheerleading the boys. The girls are cheerleading other girls as well. Those girls are a very strong force for petitioning for the right for Sadie or John or whoever to do anything. They want to get a cause, and they get a cause, and they jump on it. I wanted to lean in a little bit about being a parent of an ROGD boy. My experience of working with parents is that it's devastating to have an ROGD child.
It is.
There's no doubt. And I certainly wouldn't get into any sort of competitiveness. But the flavour of being an ROGD, the parent of an ROGD boy, it feels like you get shot by all sides. It feels like it's a very difficult,
Yeah. So The problem with being the parent of one of these boys is that your son is a victim and he's a persecutor. He is causing problems for other people. He is putting girls in uncomfortable situations. He's putting women in uncomfortable situations. He's putting the women who he lives with through the same thing that he's doing to everyone else. He's bigger. He's physically more unstable and threatening. Not everyone has issues with their sons getting abusive. I certainly did. I was when we lived with my son, we would lock ourselves into our room at night because he had become so unstable. We were terrified of him. Now, girls on testosterone have their own issues, but they're generally not 6 inches taller than you. And so it's very fearful. And, if you had a son, which I know I do, but if you had a son that was out of control and a husband who lived with you and the son was getting physical, your husband would have no issue intervening and saying, you don't treat the women in our house. It's a different problem when everyone around you is saying, oh, your husband put hands on your daughter. Like the dads don't feel like they can parent these sons anymore the way that boys need to be parented. I'm not saying that they should be punching their sons. Okay. That's not it. But there's a physicality with a father-son relationship that is no longer there when your son is saying that he's not a son. With my son, he was very aggressive with my husband, saying that my husband was abusing him. Just, how men will get that big loud voice when that was abusive. And so it's eggshells for sure. So then you go out in the world and you try to get help. And when you say, I have a son who's ROGD, no, that's what girls get. Your son is disgusting. Your son is a pervert. Your son must be gay. There's all that, but there's no help. There's no help. You don't get any help to live with him. Like, how do you maintain the daughters in your home when you've got a son who's trying to live in their skin? Because I have an older daughter as well, and that was a problem that we had. He would take her experiences and say they were his. We didn't have a clothes stealing. I know a lot of people get fixated on they must be stealing clothes and stuff. It wasn't that. It was stealing their emotional life.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is awful. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. And then you go out to get help and everyone is saying, well, you must have done this. Why? I went to a support group meeting for my former religion. And I had friends there that I'd had for, 10, 20 years. And they started going off about how horrible it was that these poor trans people are being persecuted and that this religious group was involved with it. And I don't agree that anyone should be persecuted. Nobody should be persecuted. But I said, I think you just have to be careful. There's a lot of nuance here that when we have this kind of black and white thinking about the issue, maybe you're not understanding that if you just blindly say this is the right way and this is the wrong way, that you end up in the same position you did when you were involved in the religious group. Like, you need to step back. And so then I shared a bit of my experience and they turned on me so fast. Oh. I haven't been back. They turned on me so fast and they said, why didn't you teach your son not to be a pervert? Why didn't you teach your son not to invade girls' spaces? Because I was telling them he isn't a girl. He's a boy who hates himself. He's a boy who doesn't think he can make it as a boy. And I know this to be true because I read it in his text messages. I'm not assuming this. I read it. So he hates himself. He doesn't think he can make it as a boy. He thinks that he has more girl traits than boy traits, and that's why he's unhappy. And he thinks if he takes this medicine, he will magically turn into a beautiful girl. That's what this is. No, you raised him bad. You hate you. And it's so confusing because you'll get people who say, you must hate men. That's why you did this. I wrote a journal piece once just, to get it out. And it was like, the reason your kid is trans, because you sent him to public school, no private school, You
Yeah.
sent him to parochial school. Nope, you must have homeschooled him.
Yeah.
Nope, you must have had these strict gender roles. Nope, the problem was you didn't show him the difference between a boy and the girl. The problem was you went to church. The problem is you didn't go to church. The problem is you went to the wrong church. Like, there's nothing that you can do to
Totally agree.
to the outside world that's like means that it wasn't your fault somehow.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I don't think that there's a single parent of an ROGD boy or girl, probably, but I spent a lot of time with the boy parents who don't feel it's their responsibility. And there's a difference between your fault and your responsibility, for sure. There's no parent out there that doesn't feel it's their responsibility to figure out how to get their son out of this, both for the sake of their son and for the sake of their family and for the sake of the greater world, the community. We all feel that responsibility. Absolutely. That doesn't mean it's your fault. We didn't do this. And I can say that pretty strictly too, because in our group, there's every single kind of parent in it. We have every kind of parent. We have conservative parents, we have liberal parents, we have religious parents, we have atheist parents, everything in between. There's every kind of family you can imagine. Gay parents, straight parents, white parents, black parents, everybody. What's the same as our kid? We all have the same boy. The same boy.
I'm sure there are going to be people listening to this who know a young male struggling with this or have a son going through this. Tell us a little bit about your group. I mean, I know you guys have, first of all, your website is one of the most well-organized, clear, helpful information,
Thank you.
non-pathologizing, compassionate. Like, I think it's one of the best websites out there that I've seen. I really love it.
Thank
Do you
you.
guys run monthly groups, or when you say our group, what do you mean by that for anyone who wants to join?
Sure. So we met through our parents of ROGD kids there. So you can go to parents of ROGD kids and you can get vetted to join the support groups. And then there's one specifically for boys. So we met through there. The website is not affiliated with that group. That is a support group only. But our group, we were a group that originally met through there, that we noticed that all of our boys were the same. Every boy that came into, we're like, okay, is your boy this, and this? Oh my gosh, yes. Okay, you belong here. So we all had the same boy. We tended to be the group that has started making the website. We were the researchers. So I am obviously a PhD chemist. We have a microbiologist, we have a statistician, we have some psychology people, we have some education people. So we have a variety of people, but all of us tended to be the people who were like, wanted to understand it. So we read everything and we started talking and we said, it would really be great if we had a place to put everything we read, like in one repository place, so that when new people came into the group, we wouldn't have to like, go to there and then go to here and then go to there and read this. We need like a repository. So we started talking about how we would make a repository. And then we thought, maybe it needs to not just be for us. Maybe it needs to be for people who didn't go through the group, or maybe it needs to be for some of the doctors. Like, it would be great to be able to send a doctor to a website that is like has everything there if they wanted to learn more, or maybe a therapist, and to see what the situation is. And so it kind of grew from there. We reached out, we've talked, we have a couple of different psychotherapists who are in our group that have given us feedback. We have one parent who's an excellent web designer, she was responsible for a lot of the putting the website together, and it does look fabulous. She did a great job.
Yeah.
We have a proofreader, someone who does that for a living. So we have, like, this was all parents. We didn't have any outside funding. This was completely the parents and then the people that we reached out to from our group to help us, make sure that we weren't saying anything incorrect, or that we weren't representing anything wrong, and we are a nonpartisan group. We have every political affiliation in our group. we really wanted it to be a non-judgmental place that just offered factual information so that people could have knowledge about what they were being asked to do, and accurate knowledge. Accurate.
And I want to say, we did an interview about what happens to the female body on testosterone a while
Yes.
back with Elaine Miller. And a lot of times people will reach out to me and say, hey, do you have something similar to that for boys? And even though this isn't really happening in our conversation, your website includes a fully cited, long explanation about what happens to all these different aspects of male physiology and cognition and all of these health implications. So anybody who's listening who is trying to find this information, this is a great place. Of course, there's, stats for gender and lots of other things, but I just love the way you guys organized it. So we'll definitely encourage anybody listening to go take a look. There's so much information on there and what I like about it is that it's not like a fear-mongering kind of website. No. It's just like very calm, clearly written information. So we think everyone should check it out, and we're really grateful for your time. We're going to shift into our extended conversation where we'd like to ask you about dissonance patterns you've noticed in males. I'm sure you've been in touch with families along the way who might share those stories. So before we leave this main part of the conversation, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
I would just like to share that you can find our website, rogdboys.org. We chose the word ROGD because we knew that a lot of people at least knew what that was. It's not just about ROGD, it's about men and males and how this has affected men and males. And we have our Twitter, which is ROGD Boys Exists, and where we try to tweet out information from our website just so that people have that in order to counteract some of the misinformation. And the last thing is that, for parents who have boys who are struggling with this, you're not alone. You're not crazy. This is really, really hard. And it's not your fault. This is bigger than you and your family. This isn't your fault.
I would like to ask just before we finish, because it would feel remiss not to, how do you handle the autogynephilia question, or how does that arise, or how does that get sorted? I often think it's like AGP derangement syndrome, so I was reluctant to ask it, but I feel we really should.
No. So we have an alternate model that we're developing. We don't discount that AGP exists. Actually, I have personal experience with traditional AGP in my own growing up friend group. One of my friends' fathers was very clearly autogynephilic. So my first introduction to it was when I was 10. So I'm not in denial about it. I know what it is. I've had personal experience with it. A lot of the parents in our group find that it resonates with them and their experiences with their son. So we're not saying that there's none. I mean, we just think that it's a very complicated question, and that answer feels overly simplistic to us. That's our problem with it. We definitely feel that there's a sexual and sexuality component to this. Of course there is. These are boys in puberty. Of course there is. There are websites out there of sexy trees that boys look at trees that they think look sexy. I mean, the boys, they're boys. Yes. So we don't deny, right? There is a sexuality component. What concerns, and I'll speak for myself here. I'm going to speak for me and maybe not for the group. What concerns me is we have a group of boys who are very black and white thinkers, and they want an answer. And I am very concerned with the conversation around AGP, that if these boys finally realize that they're not actually capable of turning into girls, that their answer is, well, I'm AGP. And then that gets them down another black and white hole of there's nothing I can do. I'm powerless over this. And I'm very concerned about that personally. So we have a different model that we're working on as a group. Our model is based off of shame, that these boys are having difficulty integrating who they are with their sense of shame about who they are. and that their sexuality came on board in the middle of it, and it's all tangled up together. I know that's not a very good explanation, but that's something that we're actively discussing and working on. We're trying to put together some questions to ask in our group to see if we can expand this a little more. But we just think it's such a red herring at this point. We really do. Autogynephilia is a real thing. But
it's a conversation distractor, and it just shoots off.
Yeah.
It gets 100 miles an hour, one direction. Everybody gets very heightened, and all reality goes out the window. And it gets so polarized and controversial so fast. And and
then you get, you're denying your son is a pervert.
I know.
I'm not denying anything. Yeah. I'm saying that there is a sexuality component to this, which can't be treated as if it's not part of it. It has to be integrated. But again, so if I'm going to get really technical, I would say I think that we have an integration problem of these boys' personalities, of integrating what's real, what's pretend, what they wish for, what they can't have, and sexuality is part of that integration that's going wrong. And they need to integrate their sexuality into who they are as a person and who they want to be as a person. And I'm very uncomfortable with giving any teenager or young adult a dead end to a big question like that.
Wow. Amen. That is one of the best responses I've heard to this. So I'm so glad that we got that question in. I bet. Well, we'll wrap up the main portion here, Lydia. It was awesome to talk to you. We hope that everyone gets a lot out of your website, which I know they will. And we'll start talking about desistance as we shift gears.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.